Welcome to the Quark and Roll podcast. I am your host, Quark Pui Lan. In this episode, we are going to talk about the Book of Revelation and American immigration, as well as the wider impact of the Bible on society. Joining me today is Professor Yii-Jan Lin from Yale Divinity School. Welcome.
Thank you so much for having me.
May is Asian American and Pacific Islander Heritage Month. What do you think the audience need to learn during this month?
I would like the audience members to think about the history of Asian American activism in United States history. I think recently, in the last 5 to 10 years or so, there's been a lot of focus on identity representation in entertainment and media. So there have been certain things seen as triumphs, and I don't want to take away from that. The further representation of people who look as if they belong in the AAPI community in entertainment, pop culture, media, et cetera. That's important. But I think what also gets forgotten when that focus is the long history of Asian American activists and activism for civil rights starting in the 1970s. So I think of figures like Yuri Kochiyama or Grace Lee Boggs, who left us in the last decade or so, Fred Korematsu and his filing of a court case in the Supreme Court during Japanese internment. Those figures who are really pioneering and forging a way that also created coalition with our Black sisters and brothers and other minoritized people in the United States. I think it's really important to remember that is also part of our Asian American legacy.
You are the first Asian to receive tenure at Yale Divinity School. How did you feel about that?
I feel that it's very hard to believe. It was surprising to me, but when I stopped to think about it as I was approaching tenure and submitting my tenure file, I realized that while there had been visiting professors, you among them at the Divinity School, that there had not been one single Asian person that was hired that was tenure track or full-time tenure track teaching position, or that was eventually tenured. So that just seemed really unimaginable to me. That has been the case up to 2024, actually, when I was tenured. So last year, just really incredible that is the case. But I think that's also really telling of my particular field and also pockets of theological education in a particular traditional mode, in biblical studies also particularly, which is more, I think, entrenched in particular methodologies and ways of thinking that don't necessarily have as open a reach in terms of the diversity that you can find in the field. So I was surprised. I was proud to be that person, but also sad that it was the case, that it took so long.
Do you think gender has something to do with it?
I think for sure. In higher education in general, I would say if you look across the board in terms of who gets tenured and who gets hired for tenure track, I would say that women have only more recently begun making gains to be hireable in the eyes of the institutions in those particular tracks. And I think also particularly in biblical studies, if you look even just at the general membership of the Society of Biblical Literature, overwhelmingly it is white and overwhelmingly it is male. So both of those, the intersection of those things are at work in who is receiving tenure track positions and getting tenured.
I noticed that when I attended the joint meetings of the American Academy of Religion and Society of Biblical Literature, on the AR side, we do have much more diversity. And SBL still is very male and white dominated. Is it because biblical studies assume everybody will approach the Bible maybe more or less in the same way because you're looking at historical criticism? The Bible is often treated as a historical book, so it will not matter whether you are white, black, or yellow. You look at the same book and then do the historical research the same way?
I think there's definitely something there. I think in terms of the centrality of the text to the field of biblical studies will also emphasize certain ways of thinking that will be characteristically and traditionally European, Eurocentric, and also Anglo-American centric. So a reliance on the text as a source of truth in and of itself. So not open to other methodologies of interpretation that you would find in the global South, that perhaps theology, religious understanding, religious studies, anthropologically would be more open to, but biblical studies in itself itself, because it's so rooted in a particular tradition and epistemology, would emphasize those particular points in historical study also, which is dominated and historically has been dominated by European understandings and also colonialism. And so I think that definitely has a lot to do with what we find in society biblical literature.
Your work is very different from historical studies. And you tell us why you wrote the two books. The first book, The Erotic Life of Manuscripts, talk about New Testament criticism and biological sciences. And your recent book talks about the Book of Revelation and American immigration. What prompted you to write those two books?
That's a great question. I do think that both books are very similar in the way that I'm approaching what I'm doing. Although they're vastly different topics content-wise, what I do in both of those books is to question a ruling metaphor for a particular way of thinking. So in the first book, in The Erotic Life of Manuscripts, I'm particularly focused on biological metaphors and tracing how biological metaphors gets used in thinking about texts and thinking about textual criticism and all the many different hand copies and translations and editions of the Bible and the New Testament that we have, and thinking about how we talk about that in terms of reproduction, family tree, genealogy, contamination, degeneration, which became racial terms in natural sciences and biological thinking in the 18th, 19th, 20th centuries. So I was looking at that particular metaphor. For the immigration book, I took also another ruling metaphor, which is the New Jerusalem as an identity for America, starting from its discovery by Europeans all the way through the present day, to think of the US as God's kingdom, as particularly chosen, as the promised land, and how that shapes the way we think about who gets to come in and who we need to exclude, which is very much part of the conversation right now politically. And for both of those, I think they're driven by, a healthy sense of anger. In the first, in thinking about textual criticism, I was noticing language that was creeping into what was supposedly a very scientific, quote unquote, scientific way of reading texts that used words like hybridity or complexion, right? Talking about human bodies as texts, or physiognomy, which is the way a face looks and the study of faces, which is very much steeped in racist traditions in the 19th century. And I thought, why are these words being used to think about texts and the addition of texts? And so I began to look at the way that metaphor of biology and living beings and racialized beings was used in textual criticism. And for immigration, I started thinking about that because of the names that we have in the United States to describe America itself as a shining city on a hill, or living in the San Francisco Bay Area. There are names like Golden Gate, or in Chinese, Jiujingsan, right? Old Gold Mountain, or Gold Mountain for San Francisco. And names like that had a very heavenly tone about them to identify the US as paradise, as God's ultimate destination, and how that relates to immigration. So for both of those, it was pulling at a particular thread to think about a particular metaphor that's at work.
I am holding a copy of this book, Immigration and Apocalypse. Can you talk a little bit more about what this is about?
Sure, thank you. So it is taking a look at the ways that the United States and America, from its beginning, from European discovery, has been understood as God's kingdom, or as heaven, or the New Jerusalem in Revelation 21 and 22. So I look at identification of the US as such, and the understanding that it is a final refuge, a destination that's going to be righteous, that's shining, it's full of people who are pure and good, and it's a promised land. All of those things that get used in thinking about the US, whether it's from the discoverers in European discovery period, or the colonists who came and colonized the land and felt very justified in taking the land from indigenous peoples and killing them, all the way to the present, all through Civil War, all the way through the 19th and 20th centuries into the Trump administration at the present. So I take a look at that and then see how metaphors of the heavenly city are used against people who are unwanted by particularly racist, white, supremacist nativists who believe that they now are the United States, they represent the people, and they only represent the essence of what America is. And so then the people who need to be kept out are generally those who don't fit into a particular category, the category of male, white, probably Protestant, that unquestioned identity. And so to keep out the people who don't fit into that category, the descriptions from Revelation of God's enemies are used against them. So for example, in Revelation 22:15, you have the description of outside the New Jerusalem. Who is outside? Outside are the dogs, the fornicators, the idolaters, those who practice falsehood, right? So those kinds of names you'll see are used in American discourse of immigration, talking about who immigrants that must be kept out are. They are the people who are like animals, or people who do disgusting things, who are filthy, who don't worship in the same way, aren't Christian, essentially, and are murderers, are sexually corrupting. All of that language from Revelation also gets used in the opposite direction to say that these are the people we keep out. So in the book, I focus on several different things. I focus on Chinese exclusion and the history of that starting in the 19th into the 20th century as one particular case that kind of spreads into all of immigration history afterwards. I focus on disease and plague as a way to describe unwanted immigrants and associating that with divine plague and those people who need to be kept out. And then I talk about the wall, really the building of the US-Mexico wall and the heavenly language that's used to justify that, to say that heaven has a wall around it. The New Jerusalem has a huge wall built around it, and that's justification for the US-Mexico wall.
As the book of Revelation belongs to a genre of apocalyptic literature, and we do have other books like that in the first 2 centuries in the Common Era. And some of the scholars pointed out the book is against empire, against the Roman Empire. So in your research, did you also look at the more subversive strand of apocalyptic literature?
So I do think about the ways that there are cracks in the kind of narrative that I'm telling in the book, so that it is a critique of empire. But I think what's interesting, and what many scholars also point out, is that while Revelation is a critique of empire, it also mimics what empire does, right? So the kingdom of God and the throne room of God looks like an imperial throne room in the Roman era. Or we have this absolute power and the building of a city and city walls, very much similar to the kind of kingdom and cities we would see on earth. So there's a modeling that's still shaped by empire in a very disturbing way. So what I suggest is that this is not a helpful metaphor for basing US identity on an American conceptualization, that even if there are strands of what is subversive or strands of hope, which I do think exist in the book, because it does present refuge, it does present justice in a particular way, the equation of any nation to that particular New Jerusalem is devastating and is going to cause violence, because that certainty of identity, I think, is what causes exclusion, to say that we are chosen and not those people. There's a finality and an understanding of we fulfill this prophecy that becomes incredibly harmful. And so I would say that the thrust of the book towards the end is to say that we need to separate national identity from the prophecies that we find in Revelation.
Your book came out last November when Trump intensified his anti-immigration rhetoric. And since the inauguration, he has pursued this policy of mass deportation. I wonder if you can say something about the social impact of our scholarship, especially in the field of biblical studies.
Yes, the book came out at, as you said, a very intense time and continues to be incredibly intense and rapidly evolving. The language that I pick up on in the book to talk about immigration in the United States, whether it's likening people to animals, as it was in press and waiting to come out, I saw basically all my predictions coming true in a way that I did not want it to be. So, for example, Trump saying in a debate that Haitian immigrants are eating cats and dogs, associating them with disgusting things, with consuming what's unspeakable, or the speaking of invasion, right? The use of enemy invasion, very much equating that with something apocalyptic. And then we have apocalyptic language being used all over the place in connection with Trump's presidency. And I think what I've seen is, for the audiences that I've spoke to, the students that I've worked with in thinking about this book, the feedback I've gotten is very much, this has helped me understand why this language is being used. I think for those who are not necessarily steeped in Christian nationalism or Christian dominionism and don't know the language of apocalyptic, or are relatively new to thinking about biblical apocalyptic, don't know or can't decipher necessarily right away the kind of dog whistle that's happening when immigrants are talked about in these ways. And it helps to pick that apart and say, this is the justification that's being given. This is the rhetorical move that's being made to justify what's happening. And to be able to speak up about that has been really important to the audiences that I've met. And also just as writing more publicly in different op-eds or essays that I have online in different news media has been teaching me a lot too about how to shape scholarship to be more for the public and not just for academic scholarship. That's been really impactful for me to witness and to interact with people who come to me and interview me because of their interest that lies outside of academia, but very much concerned with what's happening politically.
I know that you have been speaking about your book in different venues. And can you share how your book has been received so far?
It's been great. Like I've said, it's come at a time when I think the relevancy of the issues that I'm talking about are very clear. And so there's been an eagerness to discuss what's at work and can we talk about more of what the language is? And also, how do we read and use the Bible today in a way that can combat this? Are there strands that we can pull on that would also counter the narrative that's being used? And also, what do we do with something that's can be a very problematic text in the Bible? Those are some questions that I've gotten from audiences, whether it's from audiences at my local library or audiences in an academic setting in a university. Those are some of the key questions too of what do we do? And some of it is knowing this is very helpful in combating it and countering those particular arguments, but also just to understand and not be disoriented by the language that's being used is helpful in and of itself.
Your book cover shows two lines of people, one ancient, one modern. Can you tell us why you have selected those images if you were the person who selected them?
I am. The first is from, I think, 11th century illumination of the Apocalypse of John, or another name for Revelation. It's from a drawing that's part of a commentary on that book. And it shows the judgment of the dead, which you find in Revelation 20, in which you see all the living and the dead and all of those who have died come before judgment. And there are books that are opened, the book of life, and also other books that show what you've done. And so I call that the book of deeds. And that's where it's determined if people are going to be thrown into the lake of burning fire or if they're going to be allowed entry into the New Jerusalem. And so I thought that was a really interesting image and story that's being told in Revelation. It's also part of other apocalyptic books as well. But that's really the Customs and Border Patrol of heaven, in which you have the immigration papers that needs to be checked to see if you can go in or out. That's the mechanics of what's happening in that particular chapter. And I think there are some contradictions in what's happening in those verses in which you have your name either destined to be in the book of life or not. At the same time, you can somehow do things to qualify for entrance. It seems, it's implied. And so that's a contradiction in terms. And similarly, things are happening in U.S. immigration and what we do with naturalization and belonging that don't make sense, that operate on a similar paradoxical illogic, I think, that's contradictory. And so I chose the bottom photo, one, of course, because it mirrors what's happening in the top illumination, in the top illustration, where you have migrants who have just crossed the border facing Customs Border Patrol and other agents who are waiting to check them out, process any papers. And what's happening there is actually the father and daughter in the front of the photo. I was able to talk to the photographer who took that photo and tell me their story. They had come through being helped by or paying money to be brought into the US, and then they're turning themselves in to seek asylum, to look for a refuge in the United States. And that is not illegal to do. You can go, and that's what they're doing to go to the police at that point. And so they are, in effect, waiting for judgment and what will happen to them. And the judgment of the dead, catastrophe, disaster is very often something that happens to those who are waiting at the border in the same way. So I juxtapose those two images to show the basic premise of the book in a very short, graphic way, but also to just show the precariousness of trying to enter a place, searching for refuge, looking for promise, looking for God's city and what that can be like.
Are you working on a future project? What would it look like? Or you are taking a break from your research?
So I have two projects in mind. There's no break. I wish there were. I just feel this constant inward movement forward. So one is a collected volume of essays that will add 3 more chapters that are new in thinking about textuality. So this goes back to my first book in thinking about texts and textual criticism. And it's gathering the different essays that I've written about what is the New Testament text? What can we do with it? Where do we keep it? Who has the right to do things to it? Issues of textuality and also interpretation as a collected essays volume plus new material. And that's coming out with Erdman's in the next couple of years. The other project I'd like to pursue is thinking about borders, but beyond the US, but thinking in particular, focusing on Asia. And I'm not sure where that's going to go yet, but I'm beginning to think about particularly contested borders. They exist all over the world, but the ones that come to mind immediately are, for example, the demilitarized zone between North and South Korea, or the Taiwan Strait between Taiwan and China, and the conflict and the meaning and how Christians and others who use biblical texts and think about this religiously, how they interact with those particular borders and separations in using the Bible in particular ways.
I have not known many racial and minority scholars working in textual criticism. Can you share a little bit about your entry into that?
Yes, there are very few of us, and I could probably name the 10 of us who are, something like that. I came to this because I took a seminar in my PhD program that required that we were familiar with many of the methods, at least, that generally biblical scholars use. And one of them is textual criticism to figure out what is the correct reading, because we have so many varying handwritten copies of one text. If you have many different ones, how do you choose the right one? Is there a right one? So that kind of question got me thinking about the first book and those issues. And I think I'm just really interested in a meta criticism of looking at the way a whole field thinks about the text. That was really interesting to me and how I got into it. While I don't sit down and work on an edition the way some other textual critics do, I don't take Greek manuscripts and then adjudicate these for the United Bible Society or something like that. I am very interested in how those decisions happen. I like to think of myself as a critic that's looking at the ways that the scholars are working with the text. And that just really interests me on a bigger theoretical, critical level of how that happens, because that really is a form of power. It's a form of authority that's being used in the biblical field. And that's been really interesting. And also, I've been involved in the New Testament textual criticism committee for Society of Biblical Literature and participated in a few things here and there. That's been interesting. I've also often felt like a fish out of water, not for any ill will from anybody else, but there are so few of us. And what I do is not necessarily in agreement or alignment with what other textual critics are doing. So I would have to say I do often feel awkward and like I don't fit in.
Can you share with us what kind of courses you offer at Yale Divinity School?
So this fall, I will be teaching Revelation and Imagination. So it takes a look at the ways the texts of Revelation have been used. We do look at the ancient context, and we also look at the ways that text has been used in different pieces of art, in activism, in formations of different communities. So all sorts of ways that Revelation has been used and the apocalyptic kind of run throughout different cultural movements and societies. I also teach a course in the spring. I'll be teaching this next spring called Race in the New Testament. And that course is divided roughly into 2 parts. The first is to think about whether we can speak about race, a thing called race. What is it? What is it in the ancient world? How is it constructed possibly in the New Testament? What do we mean when we say ethnicity? Is it different than race? So big questions like that, and also thinking about it in terms of looking at ancient history. And the second part of that is to look at the ways hermeneutics have sprung explicitly out of racialized identities. So thinking about African American and Black interpretation, Latina interpretations, Asian American interpretations, and so on, of different ways that scholars have used their particular situatedness to talk about and interpret the text as well. So it's centering race and racialized identity as part of the conversation and thinking about scriptural text.
What are your advice to someone who is just beginning to study the Bible, or who may be thinking, should I do a PhD in biblical studies?
Those are 2 interesting questions. I'm not sure if I have the right answer. In terms of reading the Bible and interpreting it, I would say keep an open mind, never be certain that there's something that this is absolutely what it must mean. There's so much creativity to interpretation and possibilities. I think it's infinite to think about, and also to really think about what are ethical interpretations and how that responsibility resides in ourselves, and not to just rely on somebody else or to rely on what you think for sure is what the Bible is saying, but to think about how do I create ethical interpretation. For someone who wants to pursue a PhD, I would say everyone is going to tell you higher education, research in the humanities is fraught. It's going to be difficult and oftentimes with an unsure ending. I don't know everyone's particular situation, so you have to weigh those things in the balance. If you feel like this is really the only thing you must do, I would say then go ahead and do it. But there are other practicalities to keep in mind. I think it can be really wonderful, but I think everyone needs to be pretty aware of the realities going into that kind of pursuit, what it would entail.
Can you say something about your reaction to the Trump's administration exerting pressure on universities by threatening to cease fundings? Does that affect the general atmosphere of your school? I know that 3 Yale professors decided to go to Canada and join the University of Toronto.
Yes, for sure. And there have been several faculty-wide meetings with our administration. So we had, for example, the faculty of all professional schools at Yale meet with the provost and the president to talk about the situation. So it is an emergency, all hands on deck kind of situation that we're thinking about. What are the possibilities? What might happen if funding is pulled in a particular way? What if our endowment is taxed at a particular rate that is unsustainable? So that's very much in the forefront. And I think students also being affected in really terrible ways, and thinking about international students worried about their visa, worrying about not being able to return. So we'll get emails that say, if you're not back by spring break, come home now, or come back to the university now. All of that feels very precarious, and it is affecting, I think, the climate in our school community. I happen to be on research leave this semester, so I haven't had my ear to the ground quite as much, but I see the meetings that are taking place. I do come onto campus to be part of those. But I think there's also a sense that we don't want to obey or be compliant. We need to also take a stand. And I think there's been a lot of encouragement to see the statement from Harvard in the last couple of weeks, and to think that there is a different way, that we don't need to just lie down and let this happen. There's other ways about this.
Thank you very much for joining the podcast today. If you like the episode, please comment and subscribe. I will see you in the next episode.